What's up, everybody? Welcome to Make Things Tiny. My name is Mick. Tiny houses have been getting a lot of positive press lately in the affordable housing space. You see more and more cities developing tiny house villages for people who are homeless, spending millions of dollars on those. And you hear more and more people talking about tiny houses as an affordable housing option or even an affordable housing solution. So I think it's worth talking about whether or not tiny homes are actually an affordable housing solution. This is a topic that I'm really interested in. If you're new to the channel, please do take time to subscribe and make sure you watch to the end because I'm going to go over how much money you actually need to afford a standalone home in the US, what that translates into potentially for tiny living. So let's get into it. I've got my tea. Let's talk tiny. All right, welcome back. So today we're talking about whether or not tiny homes are an affordable housing solution. One of the reasons why we're talking about this is because it's popping up more. It's a language thing, like people are using it more to describe tiny homes. It's a topic that I'm personally interested in, so it's not really coming out of nowhere. I've spent about a decade researching issues related to housing inequality. I've got a background in sociology, public health, and psychology, so this is just something I'm interested in general, but I think it's important for us to talk about it because the language keeps coming up. And as we've talked about before in one of my previous videos, tiny homes may not be that affordable depending on who you are and definitely depending on how much you make. So let's get into this by talking about the definition. First and foremost, so there is a definition at the federal level for affordable housing. So I'm just going to show that to you guys here on the screen. The Department of Housing and Urban Development actually defines affordable housing as housing on which the occupant is paying no more than 30% of gross income for housing costs, including utilities. So let's keep that number in mind. 30%, no more than 30% of what you make before taxes should go towards housing. If that's the case, you are currently in an affordable housing situation. So I'm going to expand on that definition and just say that I also think the housing needs to be stable and secure and not put people in a position where they're financially stressed out or strained or house poor. So if we're looking at that, that's kind of going to be our backdrop. That's the number, the percentage that we're focusing on today. And we're also considering people at the median household income mark. So if you make well above the median household income, which is $78,000 in the United States, then the topic of whether or not housing is affordable might not be as relevant for you, especially if you're making like well over it. So making like 300 or 400K a year. But we're focusing on those people who are sitting right there at that median, 78K and below, because we want affordable housing for everybody. So are tiny homes affordable? We've kind of touched on this a little bit. $67,000 for the average tiny home in the United States. I would say no, because if the median household income is $78,000, that's $67,000 tiny home is not going to put them at a third of their income if they buy it outright. Maybe if they finagle things with their mortgage, but we'll touch on that later. Do they provide stability for people? We'll talk about that too. And then we're also going to just talk a little bit about what our options are for living tiny in terms of this affordable housing space. So you've got transitional housing, which we've talked a little bit about. Agape Village was on not too long ago. That's a transitional housing, tiny home village. You've got tiny house communities. That's an option. You bring your own tiny house or you buy one from them and you rent the land. We won't touch on that too much. And you can just get a tiny house on your own. But when we're looking at this entire thing, similar to the previous video on affordability, we've got to zoom out, right? So tiny houses don't exist in a vacuum. The affordability conversation really needs to be considered in connection with the traditional housing market. So let's get into that. What's the median home price in the United States right now? I've mentioned it multiple times. If you forgot, it hovers around $400,000. So let's talk about that for a second. What does that mean? That means that the bar for affordability in the United States has gone up. It's risen. So what maybe before was like 200K for the median home, that would be your bar for affordability, but now it's $400,000. So that means, in theory, don't get upset at me about this. In theory, it means that any home below $400,000 is now affordable. So then, are tiny homes affordable under that understanding of it? For sure. If it's 100K, 67K, 50K, that's an affordable home when you're just comparing it to the median home value. Now, if we look at how much money you have to make to afford that $400,000 house, that's when things get a little bit tricky. So I went to Rocket Mortgage. They've got an affordability calculator, and I typed in some numbers. And what I found that in order to afford a $400,000 house in the United States right now, particularly in California, I put in a random zip code, in California, you would have to make $130,000 a year. And that's if you put 30K down and you've got a 660 to 719 credit score. I think the average is around 705 in the US. So you've got to have a pretty solid credit score, 30K to put down, and you have to make $130,000 a year. Now, if we go back to the median household income being at 78, that means that most people cannot afford a median home. That doesn't make any sense, right? If the median home price sits above, well above, twice what most people make at the median income, we've got a problem. So that's an affordability issue right there. That's how much you need to make. You need to make $130K a year if you want to buy that $400,000 house at the median. Now, what about if you make $78,000 a year? What can you afford if you're sitting right at that median right now, either as a single person in the United States, or that's what you and your partner, your spouse, the person that you're living with in your household make combined. So if you make $78,000 a year in the United States and you still put $30,000 down and you've still got that solid 660 to 719 credit score, then you can afford a $235,000 house. Now, where are those $235,000 homes? I'm not sure, but that's well below the median. So we've got a disconnect right there. And this becomes even more problematic when you look at wages. So let's take it a step further and zoom out even more and look at the economy, because the housing market needs to be considered in connection with the economy, because how much people make affects how much they can afford when it comes to homes. So let's look at it. If you are making minimum wage, we're gonna start there. Minimum wage in the United States at the federal level, I know you're going to say make by state, it varies, and that's fine, but there are some states in the United States where it still focuses on the federal amount, so we got to look at that. That's $7.25 an hour. So if you're making $7.25 an hour in the US, you are making $1,160 a month, or $13,920 a year. You can double that if you like, if it makes you feel better for someone that's living with someone else in their household, but we're focusing on one individual right now because we want to assume that one person living in this country can afford a home and it can be affordable. So that's how much you make. You're making about $14K a year. Okay, what about if you have the highest wage in the United States? All right, this is good tea. The highest minimum wage in the United States is in San Francisco right now, and it's $18.67 an hour, which is great compared to that $7.25. But what does it translate into if you're working 40 hours a week, standard W-2, 9 to 5? It means that you would be making $2,987 a month, or $35,846 every year before taxes, right? We have to consider this. Even though the HUD definition includes your gross income, that's what they're thinking about, I want to go a step further and say an affordable house should also be something you can afford after taxes, because it's gone. It's great that you make that amount on paper, but that's not what you take home. It's not what you deal with when you're breaking down your budget. It's not what you have to consider when you're going to the grocery store. So $36K is how much you would be making if you were making the highest minimum wage that we have in the United States, which is almost 20 bucks. That would allow you to buy, drum roll please, a $70,000 home. That's what you would qualify for. Now, these are rough estimates, right? Rocket Mortgage's affordability calculator doesn't claim to be giving you like specific, legally binding advice, and that's fine. We can kind of take it, I guess, with a grain of salt, but it's important to think about. So even at the renters, even if you're looking at renters, rent in the United States is hovering around $1,400 a month. You still can't afford rent if you're making $7.25 an hour, and if you're making $18.67 an hour, it's half your income. So that doesn't qualify as affordable housing there either. So let's get back to the question. Are tiny homes affordable? What's the price? Depends, right? If you're looking at an ADU, absolutely not. ADUs can be anywhere, well above 200K. ADUs are not affordable. Our tiny houses in general affordable, $67,000. That's $70K home. Remember what you can afford. So you would, if you're making the highest amount of minimum wage, then in theory you could afford a tiny home. But what it's going to look like in terms of your monthly payment might make you feel uncomfortable. So it's not great. So I would say, in my opinion, tiny homes are not affordable, which I said before. Are they housing? Yes, of course. Kitchen, living room, bathroom. It's a house, so it's housing. Do they provide stability? I don't know. It would depend on who you ask, right? If you've got a tiny home and you've got land to put on it and you're feeling really safe and secure in that, potentially. If you have a tiny home and you're moving around a lot, maybe you don't feel as stable. So it depends on what you're doing with it, I'll say for that. Are they a solution? This is where the bigger issue of wages comes into play. So to me, a solution means it's going to eliminate or address a problem. So are tiny homes addressing the affordable housing issue that we have in the United States, where most people's housing is more than 30% of their income? I think I read somewhere that most people's housing is actually 40 to 60% of their income, which is really, really scary if you think about it. Because you could lose your job, anything could happen. Rent could go up. So that's a kind of dangerous place for most of us to be in. All right, so does it eliminate the housing issue that we have around affordability? No. When you're rich, everything's affordable. So I'm not talking about people who make 2 or 3 times the median household income in the United States. Even for some of them, housing's still not affordable, because if you live here in California, you've got to make $200K a year to qualify for a mortgage. So, it's still, it's not great for them either, but we're particularly focusing on the median. All right, so why am I talking about this? You've listened to me ramble on about this for about 10 minutes. The main reason is because I think that, I don't know, it'd probably be not necessarily the best idea or maybe the most effective use of my time to call for a language change, but I think that's a start. I think to start, the language needs to change around tiny homes. It's okay to say that something's affordable so long as you tell the people who you're referring to. So to say that tiny homes are just affordable as a whole it's just an inaccurate statement, in my opinion. You have to say that these are affordable for people who make, $100K or more a year, but they're not affordable for your average person. So I think the language needs to change. I think it's not really fair to say that they're an affordable housing option for people just because they're not $400,000 a year or $400,000 for the price. What do you think? Why do you think the language around affordability is happening in the tiny house industry? I know this is a topic that a lot of you have mentioned. I appreciate you guys mentioning this, those of you who have reached out and mentioned things in the comments. So I want to know what you think. Drop comments, have a conversation about this. Do you think tiny homes are an affordable housing solution? Why do you think the language around affordability is so prevalent in the tiny house industry? And what solution do you think is actually possible for the housing industry, from a practical standpoint, and maybe even your pie in the sky in a perfect world standpoint? As always, I appreciate you guys taking the time to just listen to what I have to say, to support all the people that I've had on the channel, for watching. I appreciate every single one of you for your comments as well too. I'm going to keep bringing you great people to have on the channel, new tiny house communities, and then more conversations like this too. So let me know what you think about this. Let me know what you think about Let's Talk Tiny at tea time. I've still got it. I just want to, have more conversations with you guys about some of the things that I'm seeing in the comments, and more than anything, you're talking about affordability. So yeah, what do you think? If you are interested in learning more about affordable housing, I've got a really cool interview with Keely and Ashley from the Kelly Factory. They talk about tiny homes and urban development, so that's an awesome one. Make sure you check that out if you haven't already. And as always, don't forget to think tiny, and I will see you guys in the next one.